for hosting me. I think I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation with you guys and be here and talking about this subject matter, because I think it's something that when we hear and have to consider writing letters of recommendation, there's probably a lot of a big mix of feelings, a variety of feelings that we experience, maybe not all of them positive per se. And we go into it, at least in my experience, without a lot of guidance. When I started writing letters, I got the request and I started writing. Nobody really gave me instructions. There really weren't any tips on how to go about writing a good letter. And because everyone has differing opinions, it's hard to say what really makes a good letter, what makes a really good high quality letter. So again, I'm really excited to be able to be here today and really hopefully just have a conversation and a discussion about writing letters and be able to form a better system and thought process for how we put together a good letter of recommendation as we approach application season. So like I said, it will be, there will be some discussions, some conversations we're having. I will be using Poll Everywhere. So just kind of be prepared for that. I'll have instructions on those slides as they come up. But as we, kind of go ahead and get started, I'll start by saying that I don't have any disclosures of interest to mention regarding to the content of this particular presentation. For this presentation, we'll start by talking about how residency programs are evaluating letters of recommendation, what actually is in the forecast letter of recommendation and the value that's placed within those different characteristics. We'll then move on to talk about some red flags, some landmines in letters of recommendation that may result in a candidate not being selected for an interview. We'll then take some of that information together and learn how to create descriptive statements that really align with the desired candidate qualities, and use all that information to then be able to hopefully, by the end of this, construct a strong letter of recommendation that will increase the likelihood of a candidate being selected for an interview, which hopefully is our end goal with writing these letters of recommendation. So just to start off, I kind of want to picture, or have you guys picture where you are and the scenario where it's December, you're thinking about the holidays that you have coming up, you're really excited, but you're staring at your inbox because you have 10 notifications from Forecast telling you that you need to write 5 letters of recommendation before you're able to start enjoying your holidays. So kind of take that feeling and think about, in one word, your first thought or feeling when you start thinking about filling out that Forecast letter of recommendation form. In the next slide, I'll ask for your responses via Poll Everywhere. And then on slide, after that, we'll then talk about or kind of get feedback on the top pressures that preceptors face when being asked to write a letter of recommendation. So hopefully this will work. My fingers are crossed. It looks like it's working. The instructions are here. So you can either join by web, going to pollev.com, entering Paul Wong RX, or you can go ahead and text in as well. All right, I got one response. Excellent. Time, yeah, definitely. I think that's maybe 2 responses there, time consuming, lots for sure. The candidate, there's sections, impressed. It's good. Some of these aren't necessarily, here we go, dread. That's one I kind of feel filled with the feeling of dread, especially when I'm thinking about 5 letters and the time that it's going to take, the stress involved in it. Definitely, I think, like I was mentioning, I think, and we're getting a sense here, letters of recommendation, it can be really stressful at time, and it fills us as letter writers with a lot of trepidation, a lot of dread as we go forward. Some of that is from the time, some of it might just be from how much pressure is put on us and not necessarily knowing the best way to approach our letters. So hopefully, again, we'll have a conversation here about, maybe relieving some of that stress that we experience while going through these letters. Thank you guys for participating. This is awesome. This helps out a lot. So we'll go ahead and hopefully no one's quitting over letters of recommendation. We'll go ahead and move on and get to the next question, which was kind of talking about our, hopefully we'll go to the next, here we go. Kind of in a few words, free response as well. thinking about the top pressures that you guys experience as preceptors when you're asked to write a letter of recommendation. Responses. How to make the candidate stand out? Absolutely. Their future is in our hands. I know that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of stress, right? Balancing the pros and cons, absolutely. If you're unimpressed with a candidate, you don't really know what to write. What if I mess up? Absolutely. This is all because it does feel like their future is in our hands, and we really need to make them shine. We need to sell them to make sure that we're doing the best for their careers. And you also want to think about, again, how you're being perceived by your colleagues, what you're writing, and to a certain extent, your reputation is on the line. Should I say no if you wouldn't recommend? Absolutely. Not sure how to make them stand out. Absolutely. How not to oversell somebody? Yeah, I mean, I think these are all really good concerns because it's not just a reflection of us; it's a reflection of the candidate, and we need to make sure we're selling them, but making sure that the program gets an actual good understanding of what the candidate has to offer and who they are as a person. No, these are great responses. I think we share a lot of the same kind of concerns and pressures as we think about our letters, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about some of these a little bit more, and we'll have some time at the end to kind of discuss openly as well. And if you guys want to drop questions in the chat and we can kind of talk through them as well, I'm more than happy to do that. But kind of move forward and start by thinking overall from a general standpoint. Letters of recommendation for our prospective PG1 pharmacy resident candidates now are submitted via the standardized form that we see in forecasts. And I kind of dread it because, despite the standardization, there's honestly there's very little guidance provided to us as letter writers on how the form should actually be completed. And that leads to a lot of variation in terms of what we end up seeing on how the letters are written and the content that's in there, and then the value that it provides to the programs themselves as they're evaluating it. So I thought together we could take a couple moments and just take a look at a letter of recommendation that could be fairly realistic and we might see on the reviewing side as we move forward into application season. So hopefully this looks semi-familiar to you guys, having filled out some of these letters of rec forms before in forecast, but you can see at the top, we have a description of time you've known the candidate, 6 months here for this candidate RJ, the relative hours per week, about 5 hours per week. See, this was a preceptor writing this particular letter of recommendation. And then we have our 13 characteristics that are evaluated on the forecast form, rated from exceeds, where they exceed what is expected to enter, all the way down to fails to meet, where they fail to meet it. And then of course, a not applicable section at the bottom. So kind of going through this form, you can see the instructions provided by forecast themselves is to address at least 3 fields, and as well as indicating the strengths or opportunities for improvement. And I'll go ahead and say that, my first time through, and I think a lot of impression through, is that, well, time is an issue, a lot of competing responsibilities. That means I fill out 3 of these boxes and kind of move on and go from there. So as we kind of read the rest of this letter of recommendation, we can see that this candidate is getting exceeds down the board. There is a comment about the writing skills that RJ's SOAP notes were well written, helpful. We then further go on to see it exceeds across the board for all these other characteristics as well. We see that RJ is on time to the rotation. When we talked about the ability to work with peers and to communicate effectively, he's had great relationships, a little typo there, not unexpected or uncommon, with everyone with whom he worked. Effective patient interactions, a comment, the patients like RJ. Dependability, RJ did not miss any days of rotation. And the last comment here about professionalism, RJ did dress professionally on a daily basis. So as you go forward, we then see the last couple boxes that are filled out and these are narrative comments asking about the nature of the interaction, the period of normal or abnormal workload, the frequency of directly observed clinical activities, and the degree of independence, and comparisons to concurrent residents, peer students, and or students from other schools. So we see the comment here is, I was RJ's preceptor for his ambulatory care APP rotation. He worked with patients before appointments and attended appointments with me. He also provided education to patients on their medications independently. We then further go on to comment on the strengths, or see comments on the strength rather. He's very inquisitive and asked a lot of questions in which showed his interest in clinical work. And he also got along well with patients and providers. Weaknesses, we see, I can't think of any weaknesses that should be noted. In our open narrative comment box, we see RJ would make an excellent resident in the ambulatory care setting. And finally, comments about the candidate's fit. We see, as your program has a heavy emphasis on ambulatory care, RJ would be a great fit, with that final box at the bottom checked for I highly recommend this candidate. So keeping this letter of recommendation in mind, my next question to you is, would you invite RJ for an interview based on this letter of recommendation? Okay, we're getting some no's, we're getting some uncertains. A couple more uncertains, definitely. Nobody thinking that this highly recommended, exceeding in all characteristics candidate should be interviewed based on this letter of recommendation. So I think that's really interesting, and I'll kind of move on from here. I thank you again for your participation. I think this is really interesting because, again, we're seeing a letter that abides by the guidance provided by forecasts, and at face value, shows that a candidate is exceeding in all capabilities and is going to be a good fit for an ambulatory care residency program. But of course, that doesn't mean everything, right? We have other considerations to make. So if we revisit the overview, and I won't spend too much time because we just covered it, going through RJ's letter of recommendation, there are 13 characteristics to be rated from exceeds to fails to meet. 3 of the sections do ask and require comments, and it's across these different 13 areas listed here. We do note that there are narrative comments across 5 boxes as well, asking for the nature of relationship with the candidate, strengths and areas for improvement, open comments and the fit for the specific program, as well as that final overall recommendation at the end, from highly recommend to do not recommend. So when we think about a value of the letter of recommendation, obviously here we can see that it does vary, even though this letter looked positive again at face value. The impression that it leaves is going to vary from person to person, as well as from program to program, and the value that it offers to the program. So I was going to have you guys work in breakout rooms. We don't have to necessarily do that, but kind of just take a moment to think about the forecast sections and evaluate candidate characteristics in order of importance, and kind of think about your top 2 to 3 and which ones you as a potential letter writer and or application reviewer would value the most. I'll go ahead and switch back to the other screen just so that we have all these candidate characteristics listed up there. Feel free to also include the overall recommendation and kind of your ranking, as well as comments on the nature relationship, the strengths and areas for improvement, as well as the open comments and what you consider to be the most valuable. So again, take a couple minutes or moments to kind of think about what you would value the most. And in a couple slides, I'll ask for some more poll everywhere responses to see kind of where we are from this standpoint. All right, so again, if you wouldn't mind to quickly type in a few top 2 to 3 rather most valued candidate characteristics that of the forecast characteristics has to be commented on that you would consider.
Hey, Paul, I'm not sure if I'm the only one, but I'm getting an issue with Poll Everywhere where it says, please log into the Poll Everywhere account registered with Paul Wong to respond. For assistance, contact Paul Wong.
Ah,
I
okay.
got the same error. I was trying to do it from a browser versus my phone.
Yeah, I tried both ways and got the same thing.
I apologize. It might be with the settings. When I created this question, it might be asking you to all to log on. So perhaps what we can do instead is if you guys are willing to, toss it in the chat, and we can use our nice Zoom chat function that I'm sure we've gotten very familiar with Zoom over the last year. Thank you guys. Yeah, so I'm seeing clinical problem solving, emotional stability, and maturity. I apologize again about the poll everywhere. Willingness to accept constructive criticism, narrative comments and feedback, willingness to accept criticism, stability, maturity, manage time, independence, effective patient interactions, time management, and communication. Thank you. This is all fantastic communication. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is great. We see critical thinking, ability to accept constructive feedback, communication skills, both oral and written. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a really nice thread that I'm kind of seeing along all of these responses in terms of kind of the intangibles, the characteristics of our candidates, not so much being focused on necessarily the clinical aspect, the knowledge base that we're looking for. And I kind of highlight that because I think when we're thinking about writing a letter and what our students are being told and kind of maybe a California effect in general, there's a lot of emphasis on the clinical side of things. And we're all here sitting in this discussion saying that, well, actually, we care a lot more about other intangibles rather than just purely their knowledge base. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. And I have more poll everywhere. Hopefully it works. And I apologize if it doesn't. We'll kind of we'll roll with the punches and go from there. So fingers crossed that this one is going to work. If not, then we'll again adjust our plan accordingly. Fantastic, thank you. All right, so again, this question, I apologize for not reading it, on a scale of not useful to extremely useful. Please rate how the letter of recommendation and the overall residency application. So we're saying we do consider it to be useful. We're seeing fairly useful, very useful. Someone changed their mind and decided to go away from extremely useful, but it does have utility that we are seeing. Maybe not as much as we would hope, and answering extremely useful, but at least fairly to very useful. I appreciate the responses. Go ahead and in the interest of time, keep moving on. I got a couple more of these. So when reviewing a candidate application, if you're sitting on that side, does a highly recommend at the end of it predict a high quality overall application? And if you're scoring an application, does the fact that it says highly recommend at the end mean that it's going to be a good overall application score? We're seeing a couple of yeses and a lot more no's. And I think this is fairly interesting because again, we're seeing that, a really large emphasis placed on that highly recommend, at least by our students. But does that necessarily mean that their overall application is a high quality one? Maybe not, is what we're seeing. Two more of these and we'll kind of move on with our discussion. When reviewing a candidate application, does a highly recommend increase the likelihood of that candidate receiving an interview invitation? Got some yeses, got some no's, absolutely. And I think, as we're seeing, we're kind of leaning more towards, well, it's a positive, right? Reflecting on the candidate. It's not necessarily going to predict how well their application scores, but it's at least a positive that, supports giving them an interview invitation. And lastly, I think this question is really interesting and I would love to see your input. When reviewing that application itself, does that highly recommend actually predict how successful they're going to be as a pharmacy resident in your program? and we're seeing a lot of no's. And this is, this is the struggle with the letters of recommendation and how we're writing them and how we're reviewing them, because we're seeing that even as letter writers, we're seeing that when we get that letter, it may not mean as much as we want it to, unfortunately. So again, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and keep moving on. I appreciate, again, your input. It's very helpful and very interesting to me, and hopefully interesting to you guys as well as we're going through. But we can see that this has been looked at before, and the forecast form itself may not be reliable in terms of predicting the overall application score that we're seeing. This was an analysis of 4 institutions and the letters of recommendation that they received. And it ended up showing a poor correlation between the ratings on the different characteristics from exceeds to fails to meet, and the overall normalized application score, considering all the other components. So on the right-hand side, you can see this jumbled chart. On the x-axis is the characteristic rating. Again, 3 is assigned to an exceeds rating, and then 1 to fails to meet. Overall application scores on the y-axis, and you can see there's a trend here, but there's a wide range of variety here. There are candidates who got good exceeds scores on the characteristic rating, but terrible application scores, and vice versa. And part of the problem that they saw is that 74% of the applicant characteristics overall from the 4 institutions were rated as exceeds. That's a large majority of the candidate characteristics. 25%-ish of applicants were rated as exceeds, actually across all of the characteristics, with 91% of applicants rated as an overall highly recommend. And that muddies the water pretty significantly. And like your question, a lot of your concerns earlier, how do you make your candidate stand out? Well, clearly, maybe it's not just these characteristic ratings that we're seeing, and that overall highly recommend. So this makes it seem like maybe the letter of rec isn't really that valuable, but it still is. This is data, rather, I apologize, from a survey that was conducted of around 300 residency program directors, and it asked them a number of questions about the letters of recommendation, including the value that they provide, and they are valuable. In this particular survey question, they asked about the different components, so the letter of intent, the academic record, the CV, as well as a letter of recommendation, as well as how valuable they were, from extremely in the dark blue to quite in the light blue, moderately in the green, slightly in the yellow, to not valuable in the red. So you can see the letters of recommendation do provide some value there, extremely quite useful to the residency program directors in this particular survey. And it's because they are able to provide comments on areas that you can't see in other areas of the application. The letters of recommendation are able to provide insight on personal traits, interpersonal communication skills. You guys emphasize communication is so important for you as wanting to precept future residents, the knowledge base that the candidate has, as well as their overall fit for residency training. So as we're on our side, we're thinking, interpreting these results, these are the areas that we want to make sure we comment on when we're writing our letters of recommendation to make our candidates really stand out compared to their peers. And furthermore, when they looked at this survey and conducted this survey a little bit more, they actually ranked the value of the candidate characteristics. And a lot of these really do align with what you guys consider to be really valuable as well. So on the right-hand side, we see the different characteristics that were included on this particular survey. The chart and the ranking is a little bit tough to read, but you can see in the light blue is extremely valuable. The gray is quite valuable. The dark blue is moderately valuable. Black is slightly valuable. And then unfortunately we have yellow is not valuable at all. So if we take our top 5, we can see a lot of these characteristics again are the intangibles. Time management, you guys mentioned, dependability, ability to work with peers, independence, ability to accept criticism. These are all things that you guys highlighted as being really important, and the residency program directors agree as well. So we're thinking about what we need to highlight in our letters. These are the areas that we really want to comment on and make sure that we're addressing to make our candidates stand out, or not, potentially depending on our goal with the letter of recommendation. And just another highlight I wanted to make, again, with the emphasis that we end up seeing, again, in California, I want to say more so than a lot of other places on knowledge base, it really ranks fairly low in terms of what the residency program directors are looking for out of the letters of recommendation. So how do we make our letters, again, more valuable? What do the residency program directors really value when they're reading the letter recommendation? So in this particular chart, you can see they ranked different narrative components, so areas for improvement, the strengths, the detail that's included, as well as the accuracy of the comments, again, from extremely to not important as at all. And you can see, of course, they would rank most of these as extremely important and quite important. We can see they're looking for, with specifically related to the detail, for specific detailed comments on the majority of boxes. And again, that's a little bit different than what we're seeing from forecasts, saying that we merely just need 3 boxes filled out, or at least 3 boxes filled out. They really want more narrative detail because they're not getting a lot from just that exceeds marking on the characteristics. So where is the gap right now? The residency program directors also responded to characterize how often they're seeing these different areas actually mentioned and addressed in the letters that they're reading. So again, you can see here the areas for improvement, strengths, detail, and accuracy, ranked from all of the time in dark blue, more than half the time in light blue, about half in green, less than half in yellow, as well as never, unfortunately, in orange. You can see, despite all the characteristics being marked as extremely quite important, we're not necessarily always addressing them, or at least that's the impression that these residency program directors are getting. Notably, with a large deficit in both the detail as well as the areas for improvement. This, I know, is a sticking point for me and for a lot of people because we're concerned about making our candidates stand out, and areas for improvement sounds like a negative that's going to, maybe be held against our candidate that we're trying to sell to this residency program. So as a question, again, to kind of get a sense of where you guys are, does the inclusion of areas of improvement in your letter negatively impact a candidate's chances of obtaining an interview invitation? Hopefully this is working.
I'm getting login required again.
I apologize for that issue. I'm sorry that this is happening. Maybe we can use the chat again to just kind of say some yeses and nos, or kind of see how our group feels. We're seeing some nos. No, depends on what the improvement is. Absolutely agree with that. Great. As this poll, unfortunately, I apologize again, is not working that well. We'll move on. And I think it's, it depends on what's shared. Thank you, I appreciate that. But I take more credibility if they're a candidate. And I think that's a really important point. Because what we're seeing, I think, is some feeling that maybe areas for improvement isn't something that we necessarily want to comment on, or when it's commented on, the most common responses that we're seeing end up being increase confidence and build clinical knowledge, which of course is the entire point of doing a residency program, is to build clinical knowledge and increase the confidence of your residents. So that isn't necessarily the most helpful area for improvement, but I know that a lot of letters are written to say that because they don't know what else to say without maybe potentially negatively impacting the candidate's chances. There is some perception that comments in this area, if construed as negative, could negatively impact a candidate's chances of receiving an interview invitation. It did not seem to be the case in this particular group, which is great. But to hopefully maybe mitigate some fears that might be related to this, in the same survey, 90% of the residency program directors said that they really did actually value constructive criticism. It didn't negatively impact their candidates' chances of receiving an interview invitation, but really just let them get a better sense of if the candidate is going to be a good fit for that program, if what they offer, the distribution of the clinical teaching, research, whatnot, is going to be a good fit for that resident, that potential resident. And I think that's a point that's highlighted, is if your candidate, if you're very clear on what the areas for improvement are, that lends credibility and that helps the program decide if it's something that they can actually improve upon and work with that resident. And of course, another poll lever question, I hope this works, but it may not. But do you guys feel pressure to mark highly recommend at the end of your letter of recommendation. And I'm going to go ahead and say it probably is not working. So hopefully maybe we can get some chat answers again.
Yeah, not working. So we'll throw them up in the chat. No worries.
Apologize. A bit, yeah, I absolutely agree. As we get more answers, I'll share my personal experience here at USC. Our students are trained to ask for strong letters of recommendation, and that always, generally speaking, implies that they're asking for a highly recommend at the end of the letter. So there is pressure, I think, from the school itself telling us as preceptors and faculty that we should be highly recommending all of our students, as well as from the students really kind of wanting just that highly recommend at the end of it. And some other comments I see here, I feel like I might not want a letter if I cannot highly recommend. Absolutely. The feeling that you should, but with comments, I don't feel like I always have to. Absolutely, I agree. And I think it's important. I'd probably advise them to seek a different preceptor if I don't feel comfortable giving a strong rec. Absolutely, absolutely. I think these are all definitely great things to do with the candidate as you're working through. And I think the other thing to kind of keep in mind as an evaluator, that highly recommend isn't necessarily the end all be all, despite, the amount of weight that maybe the school and or the students and the experiential office are putting on you. Again, there's that kind of that large, maybe undue emphasis placed on really checking that highly recommended at the end. And maybe the students and or the school, whoever, not really caring about the rest of the information that's in that letter of recommendation. But what we're seeing is that the residency program directors, they really value that extra detail, that extra information that's in there. And most of them, more than half, said that they're going to consider a candidate with any combination of highly recommend or recommend. So if you can't highly recommend, but you can recommend, you can comment on their different strengths and areas that they were exceeding in with great detail, that would be valuable. The survey further went on to mention that about 14% required at least one letter with highly recommend, while only 9% required all letters to be highly recommended, potentially a function of just how competitive, how many applications programs are getting nowadays. So I think the overall message I would say from this is, you shouldn't necessarily feel pressure to mark our highly recommended for all candidates, because I think what we're seeing is the residency program directors understand that there's a lot of pressure to do so. It's not the end all be all. They accept both highly recommend and recommend recommendations. Sorry for repeating that word so many times. So how do we take this, put this all together and make sure that we end up writing an impactful letter? So the first thing to always do is just have an open and honest discussion with the candidate. I always, whenever my students ask me for a strong letter, I turn it right back on them and I say, well, what do you think a strong letter is? What are you hoping to get out of this letter? Have a discussion about their goals for residency pursuit. And if that aligns with what you've seen out of them during their time with you on rotation. What's helpful is always to obtain a list of accomplishments relevant to the relationship you had with that candidate, as that's giving you that detail that you need to like comment on different areas of the forecast letter of recommendation form. And like some of the comments we're mentioning in the chat, really just tell a candidate if you're unable to recommend or highly recommend. You would be doing them a disservice if you end up writing them a letter and you can't recommend them without letting them know. So that's very important because they can go seek out other letter writers. They can go to their next rotation and try to improve their performance to make sure they do get that recommend or highly recommend. What we can also do is contextualize the nature of our interactions with the candidate and their performance. I think a lot of times we see some of that lacking detail in the narrative of what our workflow looked like, what we were expecting the candidates to be engaging in while they're on rotation with us, and how much ownership they took of those different responsibilities while they're on rotation with us. So it's really important to kind of characterize the context of what they were doing on a day-to-day basis from your expectations of them, and if they're meeting them, if they're exceeding them, and what they were doing to specifically exceed your expectations. So related to this, describe your relationship, how you worked with them, how closely you worked with them, the number of hours of contact, etc. Really compare them to your peers, or rather their peers, and or past candidates to give a nice quantifiable way to measure the candidate and their performance on your rotation. And finally, I think one question that's always highly relevant to address and answer is, would you want this candidate in your residency program? And I think that speaks volumes to, the fit of a program and a candidate. And finally, providing that honest and specific assessment of the candidate, again, I think is really important. I think it's tough in terms of making sure that we don't diminish a candidate's chances. We make sure that they stand out, but we need to provide that detail, provide those tangible examples that's coming from that list of examples those candidates are providing to you on what supports your rankings and how they're going to perform potentially as a future resident. And avoid that overinflation. I think one of the other comments that we saw in the discussion that was very helpful is that a lot of this has to do with credibility, what they're reading in your letter and seeing in the comments, and whether or not it feels credible. Because the moment you start losing credibility in that letter is when they start ignoring the comments that you're making, the ratings you're giving to the candidates. So avoid that overinflation. Just think about tangible evidence and details of how you can prove that a candidate showed dependability, showed independence, showed time management skills while they're on rotation with you. And again, it really does help to have that candidate really keep track of their own accomplishments and what they're doing and provide that list to you, understanding that it may be a little overinflated on their end as well. So once we get that information together, we start putting together our letter. We want to use language that's really going to make our candidates shine. So this was a study done of several years of letters of recommendation and which ones were rated highly, which one led to candidate interviews, and the words and the themes that were consistent and common throughout. So we can see across these themes, grindstone, standout, and teaching, and these example words, these are the ones that really seem to make the candidates shine, and use of these words led to greater interview invitations as a result. So we can see it's not just words like good and great and perfect per se, but we're seeing words that really describe, again, those intangible qualities of that candidate: diligence, dedication, responsibility. And again, these are things that you guys commented on as being very important and what you're looking for in a candidate. So as you're writing your letters, think about how you can change out some of those, good, great words for some of these terms that are a little bit more descriptive and help make your candidate shine. And finally, as we're finishing up our letter, we want to, check for landmines, check for red flags that might, negatively impact the candidate's chances of receiving an interview. So things to kind of keep an eye out for: marking all those characteristics as exceeds with little evidence to support. So again, even though it asks for only 3 boxes at least, we want to provide really good explanations with specific examples that really support the evaluation that we're providing for that specific rating and characteristic. We also see some brief and really nondescript overviews of the relationship with the candidate. So really describe your role in a clear sense, your rotation expectations, and how that student performed relative to those expectations. Highlight those activities the student was able to perform independently, and at what time point over the rotation that they were able to do so. We can see generic statements as being a potential landmine. We see, the student followed the assigned patients, wrote SOAP notes, participated in rounds. We see this a lot, and that's just, it's just kind of being on rotation. Those are the things that you do on rotation as a student. So really, we want to see those details of student productivity, the number of patients that they were able to follow and manage, specify how the student went above and beyond, if applicable. And again, have that student keep a running log of their successes while on rotation so that they can provide you with the hard evidence, the hard data of what they were doing. And I like to personally as well keep a log myself of what they were doing, their progress over the course of rotation. So I also have that evidence and that detail to comment on when I end up writing their letters. And finally, omitting the areas for improvement. We want to make sure we still comment on this area. It is valuable to residency program directors. You guys find it valuable as well. And we want to be candid here. Describe the areas for improvement, but also provide that detail of what the student actually did to address it and how they can further grow. Therefore, we're providing kind of an actionable plan and what the students were able to do to what could potentially be viewed as a negative. So to finish up, we can kind of revisit RJ's letter. Think about, assuming he was truly a standout candidate, think about how we would revise his letter to really highlight some of the desired candidate characteristics. across these different domains and or anything you might want to comment on. So again, I'll ask to say if you want to type some suggestions in the chat for how you might, make these statements a little bit more descriptive, a little bit better in terms of reflecting the performance of a potential candidate. That could help us kind of really hone in and emphasize how to write good descriptive statements. And I would say, as I'm going through this, I'm thinking, for effective patient interactions, rather than just say, obviously, the patients liked RJ, have an example of a specific time where RJ really spent time with a patient, what they did to elicit a strong, effective interaction, what the end result was. As in the situation, if they're able to get more information, get the patient to be more willing to be adherent to their medication therapy, amenable to the changes we're proposing. Those help in terms of describing those effective patient interactions. Those can be used to, and how maybe the student then relayed those interventions and suggestions, recommendations to the medical team, and how they handle describing the benefit of said recommendations. The team could also reflect in the ability to work with peers and communicate effectively. Revising this ability to organize and manage time, not just the fact that he's on time, but thinking about the patient load that you have and that the student had, and how they're able to be effective and efficient, and actually looking at 5 patients, pre-rounding on them, working them up, and actually identifying recommendations to make if they're able to fully identify all the interventions that should be made, and discuss those with you before rounds and whatnot. So hopefully, that gives you a sense of kind of, these are not necessarily super descriptive statements, but using actual details, hard examples of what the potential candidate would have done on rotation can help provide the detail that's necessary to support these exceeds ratings that RJ got. So I'll move forward. And again, this is kind of critiquing the narrative comments. So again, I'll ask if anyone has any comments, critiques about what they think could be done to improve some of the narrative comments. I'll leave it open for discussion.
Paul, I think you talked a little bit about it, but this areas for improvement makes me cringe by just, I can't think of any weaknesses, because everyone has something they can improve upon. Otherwise, there's no point in them doing a residency. They're practice ready and can just move into it.
Absolutely, I love that comment. Yeah, if they don't have any weaknesses, they should already be, out there as a clinical specialist taking care of patients. Absolutely.
I guess have like a sort of subjective comment when you're writing a letter of recommendation in the role of like the preceptor or the teacher or the boss, it sort of has like a different lens than like a peer letter of recommendation. Or like, someone that you work very intimately or closely with versus someone that you have more peripheral with. But I agree with Dexter's comment, like in theory, everyone should have something. And if you don't, it's sort of like, why don't you want to write something? Is it that bad? Or did you just not work with them very closely? Or,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, because then you're starting to read between the lines, because we, like you mentioned, everyone has weaknesses. We all do. So, if you're writing that, you kind of read between the lines and say, okay, well, what are they not saying here? And that's a red flag. That's something that kind of sets us off, gets us concerned. And for me, as I'm reading this, I really get nothing out of this narrative description, interactions with the candidate. This is just what students do on rotation. So I don't have a good sense of what this candidate actually did. Versus, comments on the amount of workload, the number of patients that they're seeing. Were they able to come to rotation with the patients worked up, with a plan, a clear, concise, and accurate plan that they can go then see the patients on their own independently and follow up and enact those plans. Those are helpful comments to make versus just very generic statements about, rotations just in general. This is what students do on rotation. So again, I think it's that level of detail that's really important, and using really tangible details and hard evidence, which again, I think is really hard at times, especially with so many letters that we end up getting asked to write. So I think to summarize it, and we can open it up to discussion again. I think that's probably the best part of this. So letters of recommendation, one of the most highly valued components based on the survey results that we're seeing, but there's a lot of variation in terms of the approach and kind of a lack of detail that we're seeing in these letters, and that can end up devaluing them in the end. So just some tips to keep in mind as we're writing our letters: be honest, and provide context for your ratings. Provide those examples of support for you providing an exceeds or meets rating for your candidate. And draw comparisons to the skills of others, the peers, the current, past residents, etc. And again, I think especially for those of us who get 5 to 10 letter requests, it is really helpful to have them provide a log of their interventions, of what their successes on rotation, as well as on our end, keep a log ourselves of those specific examples. Because for a rotation that started in March, come December, November, a lot of those students can sometimes blend together, or a lot of those details start to blend together. So having those logs can really help you make a really descriptive and detailed letter. So just to summarize, I have a couple of quick test questions for CE purposes. So based on this ACCP survey of the residency program directors, which are the following candidate traits do residency program directors find to be the most valuable in a letter of recommendation? Do we have writing skills, patient interactions, knowledge base, or dependability? We can use the chat to answer this question as well. I'll give you guys a couple seconds. Perfect, I see an answer for D. Right, so we have dependability. Absolutely, they're looking for, again, some of those intangibles that reflects on how well a candidate is going to be able to work within the demands of a tough residency program like UCSF. Think about so which of the following characteristics of a letter of recommendation would most likely diminish a candidate's chances of receiving an interview invitation? You see a recommend instead of a highly recommend, constructive criticism included in the weaknesses section, a brief nondescript overview of the relationship with the candidate, and finally comparison to other students with whom the author has worked. So here in the interest of time, great. C is that brief nondescript overview. So again, we want to provide that detail of what those candidates were doing. And finally, we have some words. Which of the following words is most likely to result in a candidate receiving an interview? Again, those that tend to be a little bit more descriptive talk about the intangible characteristics of a candidate that are better than some of the other ones. So I apologize, this one has bullet points. So we're going to go with diligent here is the correct answer. Listed here, I have the references that I use for this particular presentation. Thank you so much for your time, your interaction, your engagement. And if there are any other comments, discussion, more than happy to have that discussion.
Thanks for a great presentation, Paul. I was just going to add, you sort of touched on it yourself, but usually when I start like a direct rotation with a student versus like a peripheral, like a project here and there, I'll usually give them that advice of like, on all your rotations at the end of the week, jot down your significant, like independent driven contributions, not something you were sort of along for the ride for, but if you made an intervention or if you worked on a project, sort of what are some of the things that you accomplished, and to like at the end of the rotation, jot down like 3 to 4 bullet points so that at the time, months down the line, when you are applying for a residency, fellowship, or job, you can sort of refer back to those things because you won't remember them. Like if you made a patient intervention or if you worked on a QI project or something, 6 months down the line, it's going to be hard to remember the key points of it. But if you keep a running log, it'll position you better. And then that could also lend well for a letter of recommendation writer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I love that input. It's definitely something that I think we should all be doing and our candidates should all be doing on a regular basis, because all the details get really hard down the line. Absolutely.
Hey, Paul, this is Triam. Thank you for your presentation. I guess one thing that I think would be really helpful to add in a letter of recommendation is really talking about how the student you're recommending would fit well in the program. Especially if you can tailor that as best as possible. I think that also helps the reader to understand, you know, really better characteristics of the student.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really valuable, especially if you are really familiar with that program that they're applying to. That definitely helps in the end. You can use some of those connections you have to really kind of highlight where the candidate fits and how they're going to fit within that program. I absolutely agree.
And to piggyback off of that a little bit, if you don't know, Paul, you sort of touched on it a little bit, but just being really vivid with the characteristics that made the particular rotation, that rotation unique. So like following, you know, 16 patients in a 16-bed MICU or something to that effect and being able to work them up, like that speaks a lot to what the student or resident is capable of moving forward. So even if you don't know too much about that program, then the program reader can tailor their own thoughts towards it based on those recommendations.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I agree that that really helps. And using those details that the quantifiable information really gives context to the recommendations and ratings that you're giving to the candidate. Absolutely.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll thank you one last time, Paul, for giving this presentation. I think it was super helpful and really enlightening for everyone. Everyone that's on the call, this will be posted later for your review, and I'll send out a Qualtrics survey so that you can all get CE credit for this as soon as it is awarded by the School of Medicine. And Paul, thank you again so much for presenting this for us.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you so much.
Thank you.